This is Nick Redding, and you're listening to PreserveCast, a podcast with a worldwide listenership that explores the broad world of preservation from every angle, from drones to mudlarking and everything in between. Now, let's get preserving. On this week's PreserveCast, we're talking with Charles Henry, the president of the Council on Library and Information Resources, CLIR, a nonprofit organization that works with libraries, cultural institutions, and higher learning communities to improve research, teaching, and learning environments through the digitization of preservation of cultural heritage. Charles will be sharing the threat that climate change poses on cultural heritage, along with other threats, and the work that CLIR is doing to address those. All that and more on this week's PreserveCast. This is Nick Redding. You're listening to PreserveCast, and today we're excited to be talking with Charles Henry, who is the president of the Council on Library and Information Resources, which is a nonprofit that works with libraries and others to do a lot of different things, and particularly focused on digitization and preservation of cultural heritage, among many priorities. But we're going to talk all about that. But Charles, before we get into the work of the council, we like to get to know folks that we're talking to. So where'd you grow up, and what was your path to working in this field of libraries and preservation and all that good stuff?
Well, thank you, Nick. Thanks for this opportunity. It's a great pleasure to be here today and to talk about these vitally important issues. I grew up all over the place, and my father was a government worker, and we moved about every 3 or 4 years. So my youth was spent in probably about 6 or 7 different states across the U.S. So got to meet a lot of people, got to learn about very different school systems and very different approaches to living, a lot of different perspectives, with crammed into, 15 years, 15 early years. So I think that was in some ways formative. It's that kind of exposure as a kid is fairly unusual, and I'm actually grateful for it. So, I think it rounds you out in ways. I'd say I've always envied at times people who were able to live and thrive in a single environment over 15 or 20 years. But that kind of eclectic nomad existence has its virtues as well. I came to this profession into working in libraries and archives somewhat by accident. I was a PhD student at Columbia, and had dreams, like so many of my colleagues, of finishing up my research and going out and teaching and being a scholar for my career. And this was back in the 1980s, late 80s, early 90s, and there really there weren't any jobs, very, very few job opportunities. And I had been working with Pat Batten, who was the university librarian at Columbia at the time. And we'd been working on various projects, mostly focused on the new technology, the arrival of desktops and personal computing, and how that might affect the library, how that might affect research, how the faculty and students would be learning differently, doing research in new ways. And it was through Pat's encouragement that I applied for and got the job of the director of the humanities division of the Columbia University Libraries. And that was the start. So it was a matter of serendipity, happenstance, friendships, and also a really genuine feeling of intrigue and curiosity about this new, at the time, this new digital world and its implications.
So, I guess your position as the president of the Council of Library and Information Resources, is that now your day job? And talk to us about what the council is.
Yeah, it's my day job. And has been for a little over almost 13 years, I guess, and it's a kind of it represents a somewhat natural arc, I guess, from working in libraries at Columbia and then Vassar, then Rice University, and then on to the council. And the council allows me and my staff to have a kind of wider view and looking out over the landscape in more broader terms and more encompassing ways. The council's been around about 65 years. It started out in the 1950s in a number of librarians got together and museum folks got together, and they were concerned, and this is about 1957, concerned at just this incredible proliferation of information. And that included microform and microfiche, television, radio, books, journals, libraries at the time. Academic libraries were beginning a buying spree, if you will, really picking up very large numbers of new books, new titles, new collections. And it was at this point that these folks felt, the founders of the council felt, that there was not enough coordination about this proliferation of information. There was not there was not enough foresight of how to manage all this knowledge. And where they were concerned about the redundancy of knowledge, they were concerned about the costs of hundreds and even thousands of universities and colleges duplicating each other's collections. And they were just fundamentally concerned about, how do you access all this? So it's interesting. It's been 60 plus years since then, and the media of the information has changed, certainly, but the problems persist. It's still a tsunami of information that's often very difficult to access. There's a lot of great materials and resources that are hidden, that are difficult, if not impossible, to access. And so here we are, and we're still wrestling with these issues and still working with our constituents on how to better manage and make this incredible and unprecedented knowledge more useful and with greater purpose.
It would seem like the challenge has actually only gotten worse. You know, I mean, it's funny, you've been around for 60 years, and I'm sure some aspects of it have been resolved, or at least there's plans for how to handle some of it. But in terms of just the explosion of knowledge, I mean, it's funny, probably 60 years ago, they couldn't have even dreamed of how much is at our fingertips and how to organize and systemically preserve and approach that in the right way. I mean, it almost seems insurmountable.
I think basically it is insurmountable, and it's and you're right. If you go back into the 50s, I don't think there's anyone who would have foreseen this exponential increase in information. Just look at what we have today. We still have the books. We still have the journals. We also have a mountain of data that's accumulated every day, every hour, every minute. And we also have the born digital information that was non-existent back in 1957. And I remember several years ago, probably about 10, 15 years ago, Peter Lyman at the University of California, Berkeley, and some colleagues began an annual assessment of information that was generated. This is probably back in the 90s. And even then, there was a couple of years, I think, where digitally more information was created that particular year than in the entire history of human information creation. So it's well beyond that. Another kind of exponential leap today. So it's what we have, what we are confronting, what we face. Certainly doesn't have precedent, but it also, I think, puts our imagination to at a very high level of how to deal with all this, how to compensate for this. And in the end, I think we can. We've got a lot of this information will be lost, a lot we have to let go. And thereby many important decisions and priorities are required.
So, among the many challenges in sort of organizing data, figuring out who's going to collect what and not to duplicate and all those sorts of things, then you have the potential for losing things, obviously, like we've kind of touched on. And climate change is a huge component of that. Based on what you just described so far, some people listening might be like, well, wait, how does climate change, factor into this, where you're trying to organize libraries and research institutions and, figuring out how to preserve and not duplicate data? Where does climate change fit in, and how big of an issue is it for the kind of work that you do?
For the work that the council does, that CLIR does, climate change is the most important factor now. And it's dismaying to look around and see how slowly the impact of climate change, or even the reality of climate change, is acknowledged. To put it in fairly stark terms, we are at risk of losing our habitable planet. That, to me, there's no doubt about that. When you look at the effects of climate change on the cultural heritage, and this would include museums and galleries and archives and libraries, educational institutions around the world. The last figure I saw was something like 98% of our cultural institutions will be negatively affected by climate change in some degree. And that includes the more flagrant, I guess, destructions of desertification, wildfires, flooding, the kind of displacement that certain climate change effects will incur, the diaspora. We're looking at possibly over 100 million people displaced in the next 50 years, with their migration uncertainty and their new homeland uncertain. And when you think about this from a cultural perspective, a cultural heritage perspective, our legacy is profoundly under threat. And we see those effects, I think, more now than we may have 5 years ago. But the accumulating effects over the next 30, 40, 50 years, I think, is also difficult to imagine. With that loss, the potential loss, we really need to get, as my council and other cultural institutions, really need to get together and develop plans, I think, in a much more accelerated way than we have been. And it's not just museums with priceless artifacts, or libraries with rare materials and books and manuscripts and other kinds of cultural documentation that's at risk. The physical artifacts around the world are certainly threatened by this. And it's not just remote and areas of less development. I was reading, I think it was about a year ago, that the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. is looking at the incursion of the Potomac River into some of its lower levels. This is one of the best managed, best run, and wealthiest institutions in the United States. And it, too, is being threatened by, in this case, rising watershed and an incursion of water into the buildings. So every institution will at some point be touched by this. And those are the tangible cultural objects and aspects. When you look at diaspora of tens, if not hundreds of millions of people, the culture that these populations represent can be less tangible too. It's ritual, it's language itself, it's performance, it's song, it's various kinds of religious practices that are largely oral and passed down. These aspects of culture are also under threat. So it's cataclysmic. And as I said before, it really requires us to get our act together in a much more focused and vital way, it seems to me.
Well, that might be a good place to take a break and come back and talk about what those actions might be and some of the things that you're actually trying to put into practice. And we'll do that right here on PreserveCast. Historic preservation can't happen without skilled tradespeople to perform the work, and there's a critical need right now for those tradespeople. The Campaign for Historic Trades, powered by Preservation Maryland, is working to meet that need by strengthening apprenticeship opportunities within historic trades. In partnership with the National Park Service's Historic Preservation Training Center and Conservation Legacy, the campaign is currently recruiting for NPS Traditional Trades Apprenticeship Program, or TTAP. TTAP's an intensive 20-week apprenticeship that provides young adults the chance to learn historic trade skills while working on America's most iconic historic sites. Multiple positions are open for the 2022 season at national parks across the country. Visit historictrades.org for more information on TTAP and how to apply today. This is Nick Redding. You're listening to PreserveCast. We're talking with Charles Henry, who's the president of the Council on Library and Information Resources. We've been talking about his career, what he's done, and not only that, but also talking about the work of the council and the challenge associated with their work, and in particular, the challenge associated with doing this work in light of a changing climate. Before we took our break, we sort of mentioned this fact that they're just from every different angle, climate change represents a real challenge when it comes to cultural preservation and the work that you do at the council. So, and you sort of prefaced it and then ended it by saying we need to take quick action and we need to do more. What is the council doing? I mean, you've identified the challenge. What are you doing in terms of actually trying to accelerate preservation in response to this threat?
We are working. I'll use one project as an example of what we're trying to do, and I mean we're involved with sort of smaller projects in the United States of preserving marginalized communities or their archives and voices, and those are also resources that are under particular threat, and that's to basically through digitization and making those materials accessible. I think on a much larger scale, and to your point, the work that we've begun with African institutions is, I think, exemplary of what we hope to do and what we hope to do in collaboration with many other individuals and organizations. We were approached by a consortium of African libraries a couple of years ago, and the inquiry had to do with several interrelated aspects. And one was that I think 3%, perhaps 4% of what we could term as the cultural heritage of the African continent is digitized. So it's a very, very low percentage. A lot of those materials, the digital forms, the digital surrogates, are also in places that are difficult to find, even through the internet. And there's a lot of falling off of links. The metadata can become obsolescent very quickly. So there's, even in the modern era, there's many challenges, and these challenges are exacerbated by climate change, and that was another piece of this reaching out to us, reaching out to CLIR. Africa is predicted to be especially hard hit by climate change. There's a tremendous amount of desertification, which is already taking place in the Maghreb and other parts. Increased wildfires, rising seas. There's many cities along the coast of Africa, and so there was a tremendous amount of urgency in this conversation of could my organization, could CLIR, help assist, provide services that could accelerate the digitization of this culture in light of the pending threats. And we said yes, we would. We've had a lot of experience with digitization, not on that scale, but comparable to the kinds of building communities of practice, building certain protocols, following acceptable standards, and that we felt we could feasibly adapt to a continent-wide effort. So that's where we began, and we've had conversations ongoing now for a few years. We recently signed an MOU with the African Association of Universities, which I think is about 240 institutions in Africa. We also have an MOU with the network of research institutes in Africa. So we're all partnering now for this. We've begun to assess, working with dozens of interested institutions, libraries in particular, and universities, what materials they have that they feel is very most important to digitize, to help preserve and maintain over time. So I think within the next 6 months or so, we'll have a list of our initial partners and begin to raise money, serious money, to begin the digitization process. And it's not just digitization. We're looking at what I call social sustainability as part of this, and I hope that this project can be an example of a new way of thinking about preservation. In the past, you get a grant, get a great grant and from a great foundation, and there would often be a question or a box that would ask, "Is this project sustainable?" And you'd say, "Oh yeah, tick the box, no problem, it's sustainable." And what that usually, almost invariably means is that there would be some kind of financial contribution by the institution to the project once the grant funding ran out. So it was largely a money kind of sustainability. And we have found over the years that that's not ideal. And putting a little bit of money into a project once its grant goes away doesn't often encourage further innovation, and it can, in fact, cause a kind of stagnation to the projects. So what we're trying to do with the what we call Hidden Collections Africa is to do a very high quality digitization of the material in question, but also that it will involve training, on-site training, that the individuals at these institutions will be trained to not only digitize, but to help preserve the material, to contribute to cataloging, to metadata over time. And we're also working with the institutions to inculcate using these digitized resources for teaching and for research. So there will be a greater integration into the intellectual life of these institutions, both regionally and across the continent, and I think eventually across the world. And we're hoping that the training then goes on, and the trainers then train others, and there's a chain of it that eventually transcends generations. The way that curricular development will transcend and engage new generations. And so this idea of sustainability is it's culturally based and it's socially based. It's not just putting money into a project or keeping a project treading water over time, but it's actual human engagement of mind and heart in this that will, we hope, make these projects more durable.
It's a fascinating. I'm curious. What I was thinking as I was hearing this is amazing. And I think that there's a lot of implications even outside of archival and digitization and collection in terms of long-term sustainability of grant projects. And so hopefully philanthropists and funders listening take note and can think about ways of doing this kind of work across the spectrum of preservation, because I think you're completely right. Normally, sustainability is just perceived as, can you keep paying for this thing?
Yeah. Here's a new check. Yeah.
Yeah. But I'm curious, maybe one question I have as we sort of move to a conclusion here is, so what you actually use the word continent wide, like, you're talking about continent scale work. For someone listening who is at a small historic site or a museum or, a small municipality, and they're on a much different scale, where do they even start? Right? Because the conversation and the example you just gave is amazing, but like, they're not at continent scale and they just don't want to lose the story about their great little community. Does CLIR or you have something to suggest for that scale of preservation?
Yes, and I'll cite another project that's underway that tries to address this, what we could call sort of more community level challenges and small community level challenges, and how we're approaching that at the same time trying to encourage these new kinds of concepts for preservation and persistence. We have a Mellon grant that we're working with the Historically Black Colleges and Universities Library Alliance, the HBCUs, and there's currently an assessment underway to look at resources of some of the selected HBCU institutions, the libraries in particular, to see what kind of materials that they have that are particularly valuable, and that at some point soon, I hope to undertake again a kind of digitization of these materials with training and with this longer term kind of durability process in mind. What we've found so far is not surprising, that many of these schools, very small schools, some of them indeed, have invaluable community archives. And that is the record of those communities. And some of these archives go back well over 100 years. They're unique. They represent voices that would otherwise not be heard. They represent the vitality and the dialogue and the life of various communities that are at present silent and almost impossible to find. So working with the HBCU Library Alliance, working with these institutions, we're hoping to be able to reveal, on a very small scale, one by one, but something that aggregates into a mighty voice at some point. Information, resources, and insight to our national narrative. So this is primarily storytelling at its best, where the various stories can eventually accrue into what I hope would be a new national narrative, or a much richer understanding of our country and our place in it. So that's a related project that has ostensibly a smaller focus, but is, we hope, can be organized and built into something that is much more encompassing and enriching.
Well, I feel like we just scratched the surface of what CLIR does, and we'll put a link in the show notes for people to learn more about them and about your organization and how they can get more engaged and find out about these projects. And if they're an HBCU, how perhaps they can reach out and engage around that. Before we go, we always ask people if they have a favorite historic place or site.
Oh, okay. Good question. Well, let me be candid. Something does come to mind, and this may this may sound like a dodge, but I don't think it is. I had the opportunity to meet a very well-known Middle East artist recently, Oded Halawi, and he does these great sculptures. He does a lot of big sculptures. And he's also a historian. He's involved with restoring historical sites, especially in Iraq. He's Iraqi by birth, and has had to leave Iraq because of the persecutions. And someone asked him, "What country does he identify with? Because he's been so mobile." And does he consider, a particular place, as your question suggests? Is there something that's very important, or a place that's very important, suggestive to him? And he said he feels that he's part of 4 countries, very much a part, equally of 4 countries. One is Iraq, one is Israel, and one is the United States. He has a place in New York City. The 4th is, he said, the imagination. And he's been very articulate about the imagination as a place where different perspectives can play out without polarization, where various ideas can live and prosper, a place of serenity and energy, a place of possibilities. In his terms, the imagination encompasses history, it encompasses historical sites, and it also allows you to look ahead. So I would say, tagging on to Oded Halawi's insight, that the imagination right now is the place, is a historic place for me, where so much can be done and so much can be figuratively and at least theoretically put into action. And it's also a place I would encourage all of us to frequent more and more. That is that fantastic answer, and definitely the most unique answer we've ever received for that question. So we appreciate that, and I think that's a good place for people to stop and think. And really appreciate having you on and sharing this story and the good work that you guys are doing at CLIR, and look forward to catching up with you again in the future. Thanks, Nick. It's been a privilege and a pleasure, and greatly appreciated. Thanks for listening to PreserveCast. To dig deeper into this episode's story, head over to PreserveCast.org for show notes and our collection of previous episodes. Don't forget to engage with this podcast by subscribing, commenting, and leaving a review. Follow along on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at PreserveCast for even more. PreserveCast is currently recorded in Walkersville, Maryland, and sponsored by the 1772 Foundation, and powered by Preservation Maryland. Thanks for listening, and keep on preserving.